In the beginning of this lecture, we discussed the idea that economics is a study of how scarce resources are allocated. In this part of the lecture, we return to this idea. The study of economic units is that they're forced to allocate scarce resources, whether it is you or me or a firm or a company, a city, state, or country. Since resources are available to any economic agent are fixed, a trade-off must take place between different alternatives. A trade-off means that the economic agent must give up something in order to get more of something else. A common way to express this idea is there's no such thing as a free lunch. The trade-off involves two economic concepts, the idea of costs and the idea of benefits. A cost is what an individual must give up to gain something. For example, if I want a tablet computer, the cost is the price I pay for it. Costs may be non-monetary. The cost of spending time with my friends is failing my test in my economics class. A benefit is what an individual gets for giving up something. A benefit is giving money up for the tablet, is that I need to read my email without a regular computer. The benefit of failing the economic test is having a good time with my friends. Let's look at how trade-offs work by looking at a case of a young person who's given a fixed amount of money for the fall semester at a community college. Oksana is given $750. She would like to spend the money to attend community college to study computer programming. The community college has only 3 credit courses. Each 3 credit course costs $150. What are the possibilities for her money? Here's a table that summarizes how Oksana could spend her money. Let's take a minute and go through the table to see how Oksana could allocate the $750 she receives from her parents. The first possibility is that she takes 0 credits at the community college and has $750 to spend on other things. Oksana could take 3 credits at a community college and have $600 to spend on other things. She could take 6 credits at the community college and have $450 to spend on other things. She could take 9 credits at a community college and have $300 to spend on other things. She could take 12 credits at a community college and have $150 to spend on other things. She could take 15 credits at a community college and have no money to spend on other things. Economists like to use graphs to show the relationship between 2 different things, or in economics language, 2 different variables. Here's an example of a graph of Oksana's allocation problem. There are a few things to notice about the graph. First, there are 2 things being represented, or in the economist language, being graphed. One of the items is the number of community college credits. These are placed on the line running back and forth. The back and forth line is called the horizontal axis, the x-axis, or the independent axis by economists. It is important to remember that the values increase as you move your eye from left to right. Oksana's spending money is placed on the up and down line. The up and down line is called by economists either the vertical axis, the horizontal axis, or the dependent axis. The name dependent axis is often used in economics to indicate that the value on that axis is tied to or dependent on the value selected on the horizontal axis. It is important to remember that as values increase as your eye moves up from the bottom. This graph is important because it shows the data from the table describing the trade-off between the number of credits that Oksana and the amount of money she could have to spend on other things. If she takes 0 credits, she has $750 to spend on other things. If she takes 3 credits, she has $600 to spend on other things. If she takes 6 credits, she has $450 to spend on other things. If she takes 9 credits, she has $300 to spend on other things. If she takes 12 credits, she has $150 to spend on other things. If she takes 15 credits, she has $0 to spend on other things. One thing that you may find as you spend more time studying economics is that economists like graphs without numbers. The reason economists like these graphs is it allows the economist to focus on the big picture of what is happening and not worry about actual numbers. The graph itself is structured in a similar way as to the graph with numbers. The horizontal axis is called the x-axis, or the independent axis, runs from left to right. In this case, the horizontal axis represents the number of credit hours at a community college. Economists assume that as one moves from left to right, the values increase. The vertical line is called the vertical axis, the y-axis, or the dependent axis, and runs up and down. In this case, the vertical axis represents the amount of money that Oksana has to spend on other things than community college. Economists assume that as one moves from the bottom upward, the values will increase. While there are no numbers on the graph, it represents the same general idea that Oksana faces a trade-off between being able to take college credits and having money to spend on other things. To show this, the economist might pick a point on the horizontal axis and give it a name like C0. Suppose that the economist then draws a line from that point on the horizontal axis to the line representing Oksana's choices, and then draws a line from there to the vertical axis. She labels this point S0. Now, if the economist moves a little bit down the horizontal axis and picks a new spot, the economist calls this new spot C1. If the economist draws a line from C1 to the line representing Oksana's choices, and then from that line to the vertical axis, and where a new label corresponding to a new level of savings is put down, called S1. The first thing to notice here is that C1 is further down the horizontal axis, and so therefore is larger than C0. The second thing to notice is that S0 is farther up the vertical axis than S1, which implies that S1 is smaller than S0. The third thing to notice is that when the number of credits increases from C0 to C1, the amount of money that Oksana has to spend decreases from SO to S1. In many cases, the economists like graphs like this because they're interested not in whether there are changes from 10 to 5, but the fact that a decrease occurred. Or they might also be interested, they're not interested in whether the numbers change from 10 to 20, but the fact that an increase occurred. Many graphs in economics do not use numbers, but will use letters to indicate positions along the horizontal and the vertical axes. Let's look at another example of this idea of trade-offs. One day has 24 hours in it. Joe sleeps between 12 a.m. and 8 a.m. every day, which is 8 hours. In addition, he uses 4 hours for eating and other personal hygiene needs. He also wants to prepare for a career as an X-ray tech at a community college and wants to work to earn money to pay for his rent and to his food. Assume that each course takes 2 hours of class time and class and study time. Here are the possibilities for Joe's alternatives of working and studying. Notice that the sum of each activity is equal to the amount of time that Joe has during the day to do things. Joe could spend 0 hours studying and 12 hours working. He could spend 2 hours studying and 10 hours working. He could spend 4 hours studying and 8 hours working. He could spend 6 hours studying and 6 hours working. He could spend 8 hours studying and 4 hours working. He could spend 10 hours studying and 2 hours working. He could spend 12 hours studying and no hours working. There are a few things to notice about this graph. First, there are two things being represented, or in economists' language, graphed. One of the items is the number of community college credits, which are placed on the line running back and forth. The back and forth line is called by economists either the horizontal x-axis or independent axis. It is important to remember that values increase as your eye moves from left to right. The hours that Joe works is placed on the line running up and down. The up and down line is called by economists either the vertical axis, the y-axis, or the dependent axis. The name dependent axis is often used in economics to indicate the value on that axis is tied to or dependent on the values selected on the horizontal or the x-axis. It is important to remember that as your eye moves from the bottom of the line upward, the values increase. The graph is important because it shows the data from the table describing the trade-off between the number of hours spent studying and the number of hours spent working. If Joe studies 0 hours, he can work 12 hours. If Joe studies 2 hours, he can work 10 hours. If Joe studies 4 hours, he can work 8. If Joe studies 6 hours, he can work 6 hours. If Joe studies 8 hours, he can only work 4 hours. If he studies 10 hours, he can only work 2 hours. If he studies 12 hours, he will not be able to work at all. One thing that you may find as you spend more time studying economics is that economists like graphs without numbers. The reason why economists like these graphs is that it allows them to focus on the big picture of what's happening and not worry about actual numbers. The graph itself is structured in a similar way to a graph with numbers. The horizontal line is called the horizontal axis, the x-axis, or the independent axis, and it runs from left to right. In this case, the horizontal axis represents the number of hours that Joe studies. Economists assume that as one moves from left to right, the values increase. The vertical line is called the vertical axis, the y-axis, or the dependent axis, and runs up and down. In this case, the vertical axis represents the number of hours that Joe works. Economists assume as one moves upward from the bottom, the values increase. While there are no numbers on the graph, it represents the same general idea that Joe faces a trade-off between studying and working. To show this, an economist might pick a point on the horizontal axis and give it a name like C0. Suppose the economist then draws from that point on the horizontal axis to the line representing Joe's choices, and then she draws a line from there to the vertical axis. She labels the point W0. Now if the economist moves down a little bit, down the horizontal axis a bit, and picks a new spot, C1, and then draws a line from C1 to the line representing Joe's choices, and then from that line to the vertical axis, and labeling the point W1. There is 3 important things to notice about this. The first thing is to notice is that C1 is larger than C0 because it is farther to the right on the horizontal axis. The second thing to notice is that W1 is lower than W0 on the vertical axis, which implies that W1 is smaller. The third thing to notice is that as the amount of time Joe spends studying increases from C0 to C1, the amount of time that Joe spends working decreases from W0 to W1. In many cases, economists like graphs like this because they're interested not in whether there is some change from 10 to 5, but the fact that there was a decrease occurred. Or they are interested in whether there was a change. They're not interested in whether there was a change from 10 to 20, but the fact that there was an increase in the values. Let's look at a further part of this example. Joe wants to spend 14 hours studying for his degree as an X-ray tech, and he wants to work 6 hours. However, he doesn't want to give up his sleeping for 8 hours and having 4 hours for personal hygiene. What does the graph of Joe's desire look like, given that he does not want to give up his 8 hours of sleep and 4 hours for hygiene? Is Joe going to get what he wants? To see whether Joe still can have 12 hours for sleeping and personal hygiene, as well as having 6 hours to study and 14 hours to work, we need to graph this new point. To do this, we'll locate the point of hours studying on the horizontal axis, which is 14, and line it up to where that is equal to 6 hours of working. Notice that, and then we'll put a dot down to indicate that point. Notice that the dot does not line the line with the other choices, which indicates that point is not possible given the strength of only having 12 hours to work or to study. If Joe wants to be able to study for 14 hours and to work for 6, he's going to need to change his habits. Or, alternatively, he's going to not meet his desire to have extra time studying and have extra time working and have 12 hours for sleeping and personal hygiene. One of the most important graphs in economics is the production possibilities curve. In this section, you will learn about the production possibilities curve. The production possibilities curve is a pictorial or graphical representation of the trade-off between producing one good and another good for a given level of technology and resources. Production possibilities curves are also called production possibilities frontiers, or PPCs, by economists. A production possibility curve has two axes. The horizontal axis represents economic good and economic good. As with all graphs, the amount of the good increases as one moves from left to right. A second good goes on the vertical axis. As with all graphs, the amount of good increases as one moves from the bottom of the graph to the top of the graph. Here's an example of production possibilities curves where there are two goods: defense goods, military vehicles, weapons, and the salaries of the military personnel, and educational services. Firms also face production possibilities curves because they have a choice of producing one type of product or another type of product. In our example, the firm can produce either DVD players or computers, or some combination of DVD players and computers. There are two time periods that economists frequently discuss. The short term, which is a period where economic variables are unchanging or fixed. This may be as short as seconds or as long as years. The long run is a time period where economic variables may change. All points on the production possibilities curve, or PPC, are obtainable, meaning the economy or the firm can actually reach it, and efficient, that is, the firm or the country is not wasting any resources, and all resources are being utilized to their maximum capacity. This is the optimal place for a firm or an economy to be in the short run, because all the goods that can be produced are being produced. For example, a company which produces DVD players and computers has two factories, 300 and 300 workers. When both factories are working 3 shifts and the workers are all working a full shift 7 days a week, the firm is on the production possibilities curves. All the points on the production possibility curves are said to be obtainable or reachable by the firm, and efficient use is being made of all the resources. The company produces 500 computers and 300 DVD players represents one possible bundle of computers and DVD players the firm could produce when the firm's 2 factories are running 3 shifts 7 days a week. The firm could also produce 500 DVD players and 300 computers. At this point, the resources of the firm are not being fully utilized because the firm could expand production of both computers and DVDs. It is important to note that firms reach or obtain this level of production, but it's not using all the available resources efficiently. Let's take a moment to see why this point uses resources inefficiently. Notice that the point This point is below the production possibilities curve, which means that the firm is not producing as much of both goods as it could be producing. For example, the firm may be operating one factory in 2 shifts 5 days a week. Since the production is dependent on the number of factories, workers, and hours of work, the firm produces less than it could be producing. If the firm added additional resources to the production of computers and DVD players, the firm could expand its production even more. For example, the firm may open up an additional factory and operate 2 shifts 5 days a week. Once again, because we're using more resources, factories and shifts, and that means that we're producing more computers and more DVD players. If the firm operated its factories with 2 shifts 7 days a week, its production would increase even more. So by increasing the amount of time that the factories are open, the firm is producing both more computers and more DVD players. If the firm opened both factories, and one factory with 3 shifts and the other factory operating 2 shifts 7 days a week, the production would increase even more. Once again, by increasing the amount of shifts, more computers and more DVD players would be produced. Finally, a firm could produce even more if the 2 factories were running 3 shifts 7 days a week. Notice in this case, by doing that, it returns the firm to its production possibilities curve. At this point, the firm cannot operate because it's beyond the production possibilities curve. The firm neither has the resources nor the technology to reach it. A shift in the production possibilities occurs as a result of either an increase in resource or better technology. The firm may expand outward from its original production possibility curve as it builds a new factory or hires more workers, or both.